Last week, we spoke with Scott Luton, Mark Ferguson about how we are impacted by supply chains, freight, and shipping stories, and we learned about successes and failures. And maybe this week we'll talk about panic purchasing toilet paper. We found it's a lot more of an emotional story than we'd originally thought. So, of all the items that could be in demand during a pandemic, why toilet paper? Scott?
Well, so my crystal ball in 2019 did not predict that we would spend nearly as much time understanding the supply chain behind toilet paper. But that really, in the last month and a half, that's been the billion-dollar question. Look, I've never led a toilet paper manufacturing plant. I've never toured a corrugated facility that makes specifically toilet paper. But this is what my experience and all of my research leads me to believe. There's four key factors at play, which are some of the main reasons why we're finding a shortage of toilet paper. So first off, we know there's extraordinary levels of demand. We talked about what demand is the first episode, both from panic-stricken purchasing behaviors. We knew some of the hoarding behaviors going on earlier. Then we saw the minimums be placed in different retailers, but folks could still come back the following day and get two of whatever they wanted. But to be fair, we're all spending a lot more time at home. So naturally, we're not using the restrooms at different places. So naturally, there is some true and an understandable increase in demand. Secondly, unlike many other disasters that supply chains respond to, this is global. So it's not like a hurricane that hit South Carolina where things from Florida or Tennessee could be redirected to the stricken region. This is global, right? That changes things and changes how we can put in place countermeasures. I think thirdly, grocery retailers, as any business does, especially in the last 20, 25 years, we're all trying to find efficiencies, always have been. Just in the last 20, 25 years, the notion of just-in-time and lean manufacturing or lean anything has become very prevalent and very successful. So applying that to grocery retailers' supply chains, they've been carrying less inventory, right? Instead of months and months of inventory at different regional distribution centers, it could be 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks. So naturally, we have to go further upstream to get replenishment product. And I think fourthly, specifically about supply chain and the toilet paper supply chain, which is the 1,122nd time I've said that phrase, unbelievably, all this year. The toilet paper supply chain is not built for seasonal demand. It's not built for large shifts. Curiously enough, from what I've uncovered, population levels is one of the biggest factors that drive toilet paper production forecasts. It's very stable. It's very consistent. I've heard the plants that make toilet paper is like an orchestra, right? It's really fine-tuned to the hour or maybe even the minute. So when we have a global challenge like we have, and we have massive shortages driven by the first three factors, these toilet paper companies aren't going to stand up a new plant to fuel temporary demand. The ROI is not nearly there, right? So we've got to find other ways to address it. And they're increasing production, optimizing their distribution and transportation strategies, even repurposing the commercial toilet paper product that is not going to hotels and restaurants right now. So that's some of the reasons I've been able to uncover the reason why we're still struggling to have as much product as we'd like on the shelves and some of the things they're doing about it. But as Mark can attest, sooner or later, we're going to have more toilet paper coming out of our ears because the demand is not going to be there. And that's what these companies are trying to keep in mind as they figure out the countermeasures.
That's interesting. I'm probably not allowed to say this, so I have to be careful how I put it. A close friend of mine is a buyer for a major pharmacy, and she buys hand sanitizer. And she was saying early on that people were telling her, you're buying too much, you're buying too much. And she said, if we sell everything we have in stock now at a deep discount, we're still going to make a big profit. And that was the day before the president issued the first 15 days of guidelines. I can't even imagine how much has been sold since then. And like you say, it may overwhelm the retailers, but the companies will have made so much money they may not care. What you think, Mark?
Well, first, thanks, Scott, for being so thorough. You didn't leave me much. No, I can tell you've been thinking about this a lot. So I'll just add to some of the things you mentioned. The popular press has kind of picked up on the hoarding as the primary reason. I think that's actually a small component. There is certainly some truth to that. You see every once in a while someone, when there is supply, they'll buy out the store or whatever. And I think that's the psychological thing. There's a lot of uncertainty in people's lives, and they try to control some things that they can. And my God, I can't control if I'm going to get infected or not, but I'll never run out of toilet paper, I guess is kind of a mindset. But I think that's kind of a small piece. Scott was saying the manufacturing of toilet paper, I actually have been in a toilet paper manufacturing plant. Georgia Pacific has one in Savannah, not too far from us. And they make, toilet paper for households there. They don't make toilet paper for commercial businesses. And those are actually two very separate supply chains. Most of us would not want to use the toilet paper that we see in restaurants or, in our office buildings and stuff. It's usually in big, huge rolls and everything. So it wasn't easy when the demand at the household level went up and the demand at the business level went down. It wasn't easy just to substitute those. They were completely separate plants. They were completely separate supply chains. And the plant that was making, toilet paper for the household market was already running at about 95% utilization. Big, hugely expensive, very automated equipment that's made over in Germany. If you had to set up a new plant, it would take you probably, even in normal environment, 2 years to do that. So you can't just double production overnight. So, just because of the margins and everything in that business, they run very, very lean. One aspect that I don't think has really been factored in, though, is, and this is kind of gets into a basic model of inventory management that we either consciously or, subconsciously use in our own buying. When we sense there's more uncertainty in the supply, all the inventory models will tell you that you need to hold more buffer. So in normal times, I never run out of toilet paper. The grocery store always has it. So maybe I go into a grocery store once a week and I buy a 4-pack, and that's enough to last me until the next week. Well, all of a sudden I go in one week and they're out. That hasn't happened to me before. So now I have to think through, well, when I show up again and it's there, I don't want to just buy enough to cover me for 1 week. I might want to buy enough to cover me for 2 or 3 because it may not be here again the next time I come. And this is actually a well-known phenomenon in supply chains called the bullwhip effect. It's when you have a slight modification in either demand or supply, it tends to amplify up the whole supply chain. And, it basically makes the whole system less efficient. So I think that's actually a big part of what we're seeing right now, too.
Wow, I just got an education. Man, it makes so much sense why we are in this place of not having enough. And I've heard it from other people, and it's not necessarily even just toilet paper, but I've also heard of that inventory management and that bullwhip effect when people have walked into the grocery store and they see nothing on the shelves. And it's just this, and it's unnerving, globally. I think we've talked about this before, this idea of global grief. And I've never heard of the bullwhip effect.
A good analogy, Amy, is when you travel, most people eat more.
Okay.
That's because this is my hypothesis, right? It's the way I explain why I ate more. I don't know when my next meal is coming. If I'm at home, I have a very steady schedule, right? So I know I'm going to have food again at this point. When I get a chance to eat traveling, I don't really know, is it going to be 4 hours to my next meal? Is it going to be 8 hours until my next meal?
Along those lines, Mark, when I think of the bullwhip effect, and I think of other ways that you can illustrate that, there was an old game I think everybody's probably played at least one time. It's not a really good game, but we play it for whatever reason, where you get a circle of people and everyone whispers a sentence right at the beginning in the next person's ear, and then you go around to 10 or 12 people, and each time the translation gets further and further off to the point where you get to the last person and it's really off. That same thing with the bullwhip effect. As you go upstream and order more, each node attempts to have to cover a little bit bigger bogey or feel inclined to cover a little bit bigger bogey. And so by the time you get to the raw materials or what have you, they just can't support it. But great example. I like your eating example better, Mark, because I'm guilty as charged as well.
Thanks.
Oh, those are great. And again, for the average person, as we're trying to navigate this, I think these word pictures help us understand a little bit. And it kind of leads us right into our next question. And both of you have answered this, kind of skimmed it on our last episode. But Scott, what do you think is the teachable opportunity in this universal pandemic affecting supply and demand? What will be our takeaway for humanity?
That's a really tough question. So I'm just going to be real succinct about it because there's going to be so much time and attention once we break through and get to what the aftermath, right? And there's going to be some things we learned during that period that will need to factor into what the most important lessons learned will be. So easy ones for me: risk management, awareness, and mitigation. Lots of lessons are going to be learned in that regard. I've had people tell me that there's going to be a lot more chief risk management officers in organizations. I find that to be interesting. As Mark has alluded to, inventory management strategies will be certainly revisited for some industries. We were on the phone earlier today on an interview with a robotics company that's expanded largely here in the U.S. That's a huge trend. What has already been around and been leveraged for a long time, surprising to some people, that's going to continue to surge, robotics and automation initiatives. And what I like to say, what I think we see when it comes to the humanity play here is the empathy that we're seeing, whether it's on conference calls, whether you got dogs in the background or kids running in. We're all going through this together. And I think the power of empathy is what hopefully will be one of the critical lessons learned for humanity.
Yeah, I love that. I was on a conference call with 76 other teachers, a Zoom call, and, half of us are having, kids running in and out, and you're watching the pandemic of being a teacher and having your kids at the same place. So I really appreciate that, Scott. What about you, Mark?
I think there's going to be a lot we can learn from this. I like to try to find past events that have some similarities that I think maybe we can build some better understanding from. And I actually see similarities to the financial crisis of 2008. So if you think about what happened then, it was cash liquidity that dried up. So maybe each bank is required to hold a certain amount of cash reserves. And if a lot of customers of Bank A come in and ask for cash for whatever reason, and they run out, there's a support system in place. It wasn't as robust as we thought it was, and we've had some policies to improve it since then. But there was kind of if you think about it at our country's level, there's the Federal Reserve that kind of sits over the whole banking system. So if Bank A runs short, the Federal Reserve can facilitate Bank B, who may have extra cash reserve, to kind of send some over temporarily in a short-term loan. And they facilitate the matching of supply and demand on the financial side. So what we're seeing with this crisis is actually kind of encouraging and surprising on that aspect so far. We haven't seen the same problems in the financial industry, at least not yet, even though there's some of the same pressures. There's a huge need for short-term liquidity. Companies are not bringing in any revenue. They've got to make it until we get to the end of this and they start bringing in revenue again. And I think a lot of that came from the lessons that we learned and the systems that we put in place. we almost need the same thing on the product side, right? So you need something at a national level that will do the equivalent of a stress test for the supply chains of critical components. Kind of like I was talking in the last podcast about playing what if games. What if this happens, right? That's exactly what they do with the banks. And they make sure that they're holding enough buffer. In the bank's case, it's cash or cash reserves, to handle uncertain events. But on the product side, it would be the actual inventory or alternative sourcing options or whatever to be able to, maybe prepare for these black swan events. You don't know what exactly it'll be, but you can, have a organization. I don't know if it's a government organization or industry organization or something that kind of sits at the top and helps facilitate this, and also helps when there's an imbalance. If company A over there has too many respirators and company B is critically short, how do you match those two together? I've had a lot of calls over the last weeks of people saying, hey, I want to donate, mask or something. I don't know who to contact, or I'm desperate need of this. Who could I help? A lot of former students and all are trying to do this without having some national mechanism for matching them together.
That's amazing. I really think that definitely that would be something, that stress test for supply chains with the facilitation of some sort of balance nationally that's got to happen. That's key. Appreciate that.
Thinking about this whole conversation up to this point, as well as what we're experiencing as we're recording this, I've read a lot of novels about pandemics, stories about the end of the world. And the character's main fear is always something like they'll catch the virus or they'll be murdered by a roving band of looters or something. But during a real pandemic, at least in the US and probably Europe, many people's fears have had to do with disrupted supply chains. So if you were going to write a story, if you were going to tell a story that was more accurate about what would happen if global supply chains got broken, how would you write an accurate story about what would happen if global supply chains got fractured?
So, Holland, I like to stay very positive, but it's really important that we're frank and direct, and we recognize exactly the reality that's taken place. So, you don't need me to tell any of y'all or any of your listeners about how unsettling the gas lines were in 1970s or 2008, what Mark shared earlier, or the empty shelves we're seeing today. It's a shock to the system, and it adds significantly more to the overall level of anxiety, right? That we all are experiencing, some much more than others, and rightly so. But there's current sectors right now across the global supply chain community that are getting absolutely hammered. And that's kind of where my head goes. Chinese factories, as we all talked about, were shut down as they were trying to get containment for 2 months. And we're still going to see the impact of that in large degree, not trying to make anyone panic, but we're going to still see that at some point. I was on some sites last night looking at electronics, and 2-day deliveries have moved to 3 or 4 weeks, and including first to ship based on different factors. So we're going to need to keep an eye on electronics. And of course, as Chinese factories by and large start to come back online, the U.S. began shutting down factories. Right now, according to the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, 42 of the 44 auto assembly plants in the U.S. all have been idled due to the coronavirus outbreak. Now, my big concern there is, and I probably share that with many folks out there, I've spent a little bit of time in metal stamping, is what's that economic impact? Of course, the current workers, right, that are all have anxiety and need paychecks. And of course, we have this health scare. Of course, our hearts and minds go there, but also the extended automotive supply chain. The Great Recession that Mark spoke to earlier put a lot of metal stampers and the like out of business. I'm worried that the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers may not have the wherewithal to get through, especially if this is going to be an extended state of shutdown. So the aerospace has similar challenges. If any of y'all have been, of course, following the Boeing saga, which had its hands full much prior to the coronavirus, when the 737 production line went down, analysts factored that into GDP expectations for 2020. That's how important these programs are to really the global economy, but certainly the national economy. So, but expect this. I bet Mark has already heard this phrase. I know I already have, and there's going to be a lot more that we hear about supply chain resilience in the coming months and years. For the last couple of years, it's been about visibility, and that's not going anywhere. But this resilience and resiliency is what we're going to be, a lot of supply chain leaders are going to be focusing around. No supply chains are invincible. Holland, to your question, some are certainly more resilient than others. But I think the good news here, with all of that, not quite doom and gloom, but that all that accurate picture being painted, generally speaking, even in these challenging times, our supply chains are finding a way to execute, persevere, and keep a lot of products on the shelves that you can't exactly find in other parts of the world. And that's testament to just how resilient supply chains are and just how resilient they are to not being broken.
Wow. That wasn't quite the answer I was expecting, but that's a great one. Mark, what do you think?
So, I think we're seeing a mild version of supply chains being broken right now, like we're living through it, and hopefully it'll stay mild. But if we ever, unfortunately, reach the point of really widespread shortages, across the board of products and everything, I think we have some examples around the world. Venezuela is a good example right now, where basic needs of people, products that, everyday needs are not there. And people will spend their entire days going around trying to procure these items through whatever means they can. It usually is coupled with a breakdown of the monetary system. So people resort to bartering. So maybe my neighbor has chickens in his backyard and has some extra eggs, and I have extra laundry detergent or something, right? Hopefully it never comes to that, but it's all about supply chains, and scarcity is all about substitution. So this is probably going to force a lot of us to think about what are our basic needs and what's more kind of frivolous, and what would we do in situations where we don't have such abundance and variety to choose from.
Holland and Mark and Amy, there's a scene in the movie Mars Attacks with Jack Nicholson. I think it came out in the mid-90s. And of course, in the movie, it's all about Martians invading and taking over. And there's a scene where the president, which is portrayed by Jack Nicholson, is in the Oval Office. And I think Congress had just been zapped and wiped out. And the president goes, "We still have 2 of 3 branches of government working, and that's not bad." And, that's a lighter moment in the movie, but I can't help. We were talking, I'm not sure who I was chatting with. And, there is, to Mark's point, there is a lot of things that are new in terms of visuals for most consumers. But even that said, there's so much that's still working. And I share the optimism that we heard from Mark. Holy cow, I certainly hope things don't fall off the shelf. You never know. We don't know what's around the corner, and supply chain's really good at predicting that in many ways, despite the current scenarios. The good news here is a lot of things are still working well, and in spite of the challenges, and we've got to do, I think what we have to do, regardless if you're American or Brazilian or what have you, is we've got to take what our healthcare experts are telling us and what they're asking us to do and do our own part, because that's going to help protect all of these folks on the front line.
Yeah, well said. And, I think you said earlier that things could be so much worse. And again, we've got to keep that balance. And Mark, you were talking about having that balance, that stress test, that, if you will, to help us balance that out. But, and you both mentioned it in talking about kind of hopping around to other countries, Venezuela, Mark, and you were talking about some other ones, Scott. But the stories of supply chains are woven into the fabric of national and international identity. And some experts are saying that in the near term, we will see countries develop more internal supply chains because they don't want to risk dependency on a nation like we were explaining, Scott, like China, that might have abruptly shut down. And other experts say that the current international goodwill will actually strengthen global supply chains and end calls for protectionism. So, Mark, I'm going to toss this to you first. What do you think the story is?
I'm not going to make a forecast on that because there's so many players involved with agendas on that. But, it was really unfortunate, I think, that this worldwide epidemic happened at this particular point in the international relations regarding trade. Even if this had been 3 years ago, I think we would have seen a lot more cooperation between countries in terms of sharing resources and everything. I mean, the fact that the U.S. did not have just the basic test to test for the virus when other countries had plenty and were kind of coming out of their worst times of the epidemic is I think something we're going to look back as a really missed opportunity. So I'm going to be hopeful and say that we will appreciate, the cooperation aspect more. But also, when we do hopefully start these stress tests and building more resilient supply chains and all, we probably always have to factor in that outside sources may not be available. It could be a natural catastrophe where it just completely wipes out a certain part of the world, or disables it for a certain amount of time. And we need to, at least, especially for critical components like medical supplies and everything, we tend to do that for military components, but we don't really think about it in terms of medical supplies.
Yeah, that's excellent. And that's true. I mean, we are having to think differently. I think this whole thing is putting people on the back of their heels a little bit to contemplate and think about what are the next stories going to be. And I appreciate that, Mark. What about you, Scott?
Okay, so this is my least favorite question of the interview, but it's an important one because it's going to be the questions facing thousands of company executives at the Fortune 100 and all the small companies and all points in between. So like Mark, I can't offer a forecast. There's so much still to play out, right? We're only getting half the story. That's not a pointing the finger at anyone. It's just a situation. But 2 quick points come to mind. I think, as always, consumer sentiment is the North Star. People have told me, in a couple of years, once we get past the aftermath into the new normal, price is going to be a huge consideration. And that's one of the big reasons why we have global supply chains. We got to face that. I'm not so sure that is, in terms of the consumer sensitivity around price, I'm not so sure that's going to change. Global supply chains aren't going to seek out some of the sources that they go to. But secondly, what we know is taking place now, Mark alluded to it, it will ramp up, especially as we move again into the aftermath where, it's been contained and defeated and we're dealing with the repercussions. A lot of sectors are going to be thoroughly reviewing current procurement practices, especially when it comes to certain geographic markets. We're going to see, Mark spoke about the what ifs. I think we're going to see a lot more of that, the contingency and the scenario planning with probably a big emphasis or maybe even a greater emphasis on redundancy and certainly diversified sourcing strategies. We spoke with an attorney behind closed doors a week or two back, and he's currently he's got a lot of supply chain expertise and he's advising a lot of companies right now. And verification of your global supply chain is what a lot of leaders are doing right now. Think of not just availability, but quality, safety, and of course, what the consumers think and what snap decisions or judgments or assumptions are they going to make as they read the label, so to speak. So we're going to see a whole lot more of supply chain verification, but As we've all alluded to, there's so many moving pieces right now. It's so tough to make some of these decisions. So I look forward to seeing a lot more data and a lot more certainty come about so that we can have a more educated discussion.
Yeah. And I hate to throw those tough questions at you, but I think this one was a really important question. I really appreciate both of your feedback on that.
Absolutely. Great question. Great question.
Well, speaking of tough questions, what's a metaphor to help us understand supply chain stories?
Mark, I'm going to let you be the lead block here. How about that?
All right. So I thought about this a little bit. I actually can't come up with a good metaphor, but I don't think we need one. And here's the reason. If you are involved in managing a household, even if you're living by yourself, right? We are all supply chain managers on a small scale. We have to go out and procure food, clothing. We have to figure out assemblies. So if you're cooking something, there's a lot of ingredients that go into that. You have to source all of those ingredients. You have to manage the inventory, stock them together. We have lead times. Are you going for low cost? Are you going for quality? How do you ensure, a certain quality level for the stuff that you buy? We all do this. We may not think about it, but we all actually have some experience as supply chain managers, and just scale that up. And that's a global supply chain.
Wow. That's pretty good. I like that. Let's hear it, Scott. Let's give it.
Mark, I'm with you. I couldn't think. First off, I had to go to the dictionary and look up what a metaphor is because I always get it confused with similes. So I always have since third grade. But I couldn't think of a perfect one. So y'all bear with me. An automotive engine, right? Or maybe an American football team or a soccer team. The human body. Regardless, you've got all of these, a system built of a wide variety of independent nodes that each offer unique capabilities and unique functions in many ways, or different ways to add value to the system. But at the backbone of this system is that traditional definition, I would argue, of supply chain, that transportation and logistics. That's what is so vital that connects all those nodes. And that's what's, of course, has to keep moving in this environment. And at the heart of it all is certainly the consumer, right? Without consumer demand and without interest in that wide variety of products that we've all spoken about through this episode here, there's no need to assemble a domestic supply chain or a global one for that matter.
This has been fascinating, Holland. I don't know about you, but my notes are just flowing all over our question pages.
Wow. Yeah, this was great. It was more of an emotional conversation, more of a human-centered conversation than I expected. I think of supply chains as stuff, but not as the people that are impacted all along the route. Wow, this was really, really good. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Mark and Scott, for joining us. And this has just been a really, I agree with Holland, heartwarming. First, we thought we all were going to be talking about toilet paper, and you guys pull our heartstrings.
Well, thank you, Amy and Holland.
Pleasure. That's right. Thank you both. Thank you for what you do. Love the Afterword, and it's going to be on my list of faves, new list of faves for podcasts.
Awesome. Join us at the table next week as we have a different conversation. We're moving out of supply chains to a conversation with Rich Williams and Brett Tepper. They're both of Modcat, and why animal stories are so popular and how the appeal to humans is almost irresistible. But while you wait, please leave us a review, rate us on iTunes, become a subscriber to theafterwordpodcast.com. It does help us keep the conversations going. And as always, please remember, you are welcome at our table.